Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to Business Law 1. Today we're going to be looking at Chapter 19, which involves performance and remedies. The overall learning objectives for this chapter, I want us to be able to understand what performance is expected of the seller as well as the buyer in sales contracts, what rights and duties the buyer has if there is an issue with non-performance or non-conforming deliveries, how in general the UCC approaches remedies, and then in a very generalized sense we'll look at remedies that sellers and buyers have in their contractual relationship. So when we talk about general obligations that exist in a contract, one of the very basic or fundamental premises that we tend to gloss over, but is always present, or at least assumed to be present, is the idea of obligation of good faith. And so every contract has at its very base that people at the time that they executed the agreement, that they did so with the best of intentions in order to perform as promised. For merchants and non-merchants, this good faith means honesty in fact in the terms of their conduct. If we're talking about exclusively just merchants, so let's say manufacturer to wholesaler, or manufacturer to retailer, or wholesaler to retailer, whichever in that supply chain relationship, the UCC also imposes the additional requirement of observing reasonable commercial standards of fair dealing in the trade. So they do recognize maybe some variations that could exist within a variety of different types of industries. So they, when you think of like accepted practices, when a buyer or seller refuses to perform a contract when it is due, that is called repudiation, or that's a breach. Repudiation made in advance of the time for performance is called an anticipatory repudiation. If you remember, when we talked about breaches before, both repudiation and anticipatory repudiation, both are considered a breach of contract. With anticipatory, you could wait until the actual latest possible moment is to perform, hoping that there might be a change of heart or circumstance. But upon official notification, that advance notice, you could just treat it as breached at that point. If either party to a contract feels insecure about the other party's ability to perform as promised, this can come in a variety of different ways. It could be if you're monitoring the credit report of like another party to a contract, if maybe there's some news event that has come to light. It can't just be that you have a hunch or you have a suspicious feeling or something. It has to be articulable. Then you can demand of the other person what's called in writing, which is what's called an adequate assurance of performance. And so as long as you articulate that, because of this event, whatever it is, your credit score has dropped, maybe I saw in the local news that your manufacturing facility is burned down, something has happened, you would use that as the basis for why you need assurances. And if adequate assurance is not given, then you may treat the contract as being repudiated at that point. But the key thing, just to kind of touch on that, one final thing, is that you have to have that kind of whatever that event is that justifies you feeling insecure about the other side's ability to perform. If you can't articulate it, then there's no repudiation at that point. When we talk about the bundle of seller's duties, the seller has a duty to deliver the goods in accordance with the terms of the contract. So time, place, manner of delivery, what was ordered, obviously, all of those particular details, whatever the contract requires, and nothing that deviates from that. The buyer, upon receipt, has the duty, or I shouldn't say duty, but has the ability to inspect the goods to ensure that they comply excuse me, with the terms of the contract. So it could be that maybe the inspection that includes the right to maybe open up various boxes or cartons, conduct tests if necessary. Depending on the delivery form, if delivery is cash on delivery or COD, then you could certainly insist upon payment first. before you have the right to do an inspection. Generally, the buyer has no right to inspect until that COD payment has been made, if delivery is made in that manner. If the inspection reveals that there are non-conforming goods, so maybe it's a different quality than what was ordered, or things were damaged in shipment, or some other issue, so that it basically creates an environment where the goods are non-conforming in some way, then the seller usually must be offered the chance to either replace the goods or to cure the problem. So, and I mean, this is kind of like standard. You order inventory, and maybe you're expecting to get A, B, and C in terms of goods to be delivered. Maybe A, B, and C are delivered, but they're of a different quality, color, style, whatever it is, than what you had ordered. So, like with anything, you're going to immediately call the person who sold you these goods, and you're going to say, look, what was sent was incorrect, and they can fix that. Excuse me. Hopefully, they'll be able to fix that. If the goods are conforming, then the buyer has the obligation to accept the goods as delivered. So if everything was delivered as per what you had contracted for, then there's no basis to reject the shipment or to say it's non-conforming, because it's conforming at that point. So that's always something to kind of bear in mind. In terms of the buyer's right to reject, it could be in commercial units, it could be in specific units. Whatever is easier in terms of how these particular goods can be kind of put together, the ones that are conforming versus non-conforming. The buyer obviously has to give notice of rejection to the seller, and then they cannot do anything that's inconsistent with the ownership rights of the seller. So let's say that I have a store, retail, and there's a delivery of goods, and a portion of the goods are non-conforming. I can't just leave the non-conforming goods like outside behind my building, and I call the seller and say, hey, you better pick this up. This isn't what I ordered. If you leave anything outside, especially here in Florida, it's going to disappear. So you do have to maintain, the integrity and the security for what was ordered. So that's what's meant by, trying to kind of, you can't do anything that's inconsistent with the ownership rights. You have to protect it from some type of, shrinkage or damage or whatever. Revocation of acceptance. The buyer may revoke acceptance even if acceptance was offered, if problems with the goods that substantially impair their value were not easily discoverable. So maybe, sometimes, you get a drop shipment of an entire semi truck full of inventory. And it's like, well, you might not have time, and as it comes off the truck, to inspect everything. And so even though you accepted it, you may at some future point have to reject something if it was non-conforming or damaged, or if there's an issue involved with it. The buyer also must hold the goods and await instructions from the seller once that notification of an issue has been given. So hopefully the seller will give specific instructions, like we'll send a truck out, as soon as possible, same day, different day, whichever, and we'll pick up what was non-conforming and we'll drop off what is conforming to complete your contract. When we talk about statute of limitations, remember that's like an expiration window that if you go past it, you foreclose any opportunity to kind of have recovery in a court of law. So under the UCC, remedies are usually subjected to a 4-year statute of limitations. If you're going outside the UCC, then we're going to be looking at tort or contract, and that could be 2 to 4 years on average. But depending on the nature and the type of case, it might actually be longer. That's where you would have to consult with an attorney in order to know in your specific case what the proper statute of limitations is. When we talk about remedies of the seller, this is where the other side, the buyer, there's having some kind of an issue with performance. The seller can obviously put a lien on the goods until they're paid. They have the right to resell the goods. They have the right to cancel the sales contract. And they also have the right to bring an action for damages, and that could include lost profits, if the buyer does not perform as promised, meaning the buyer has to pay for stuff that is conforming. The seller may also be able to recover reasonable incidental damages. So, let's say they have storage costs, or maybe if goods were wrongfully rejected, there might be additional shipping costs. So those would be things that the seller would be able to recover on. Remedies of the buyer include rejection of non-conforming goods. So if things are, not what you had ordered, or if they're damaged in some way, you don't have to accept them. You could do revocation of acceptance if it's not easily discoverable, which we discussed. You could have an action for damages for non-delivery of incidental and consequential damages. Let's say that the delivery never occurred, and so you have to go to another company in order to source whatever supply it is, and let's say now you have to pay a premium for those goods. That would be something where it's like you could seek recovery from the previous contracted party that failed to perform as promised. There might be warranty issues that you could sue over, as well as you could try and cancel the sales contract. You could resell the goods. You have you have all these different bundle of rights as the party that is the buyer that's aggrieved because of something the seller has done. Other types of damages, in a lot of modern contracts now, the general trend, especially in business-to-business contracts as well as in international business contracts, is this idea of liquidated damages. So both sides agree to pay a penalty fee if the deal just explodes, and it doesn't get performed as promised. So by default, we're not going to get into, who's at fault. We're not going to get into, were you justified? You just agree ahead of time. This is the liquidated damages. This is what we'll come up with. You can agree in a contract. Generally, this is done between or among merchants, not with consumers. But the idea of exclusion of damages, it has to be commercially reasonable and fair. If not, then it's going to be considered unconscionable. You can have limits on statutory remedies. So whether it's repair, replace, or refund, because of a breach. And then you also could have some kind of a waiver of legally entitled statutory damages. And again, this is something that usually is offered between merchants in order to get maybe some kind of favorable price point. When you're dealing with consumers, there's a lot of consumer protection statutes that would prevent companies from doing some of these types of activities. So again, just think generally business-to-business type transactions. The last slide that I'll show you is this is the problem, and in the PowerPoint file, I don't always discuss the problems that are at the end of each chapter, but this one I like because it kind of reviews through from the buyer's perspective what their rights are in terms of remedies. So it says Mrs. Kirby purchased a wheelchair from NMC Continue Care. The wheelchair was customized for her and her home. When the wheelchair arrived, it was too wide to fit through the doorways in her home. And then the prompt is identify options available to Mrs. Kirby and recommend which one she should exercise. So in a traditional face-to-face class, I would have students kind of, pair up and, you guys would bounce ideas off of each other of what Mrs. Kirby could do as a buyer who now is faced with a non-conforming good, essentially what she did not order. So I have kind of listed here, and I know it might be a little blurry to see, but I have listed like red, yellow, green, and green are the options that probably would be her best or most advantageous things that she could do. So obviously reject non-conforming goods. She can call NMC Continue Care and say, pick up your wheelchair. It won't work. It doesn't fit in my house. Also, even though she accepted it, she could revoke that acceptance. So that's another option that would be like the green or the ideal option she could employ. She could sue for an action for breach of warranty, because obviously if it's customized, there is a warranty associated with that customization process that's been violated. And then very simply just cancel the sales contract. Say, pick this up. I don't want to do business with you anymore. So those are all of her options. What I have in yellow is she could obviously resell the goods, which again, that's not really practical. I mean, she's elderly, and I mean, it's better to just return it. But I mean, she could resell it if she wanted to. She has the right to sue for damages and cancel if the seller has been negligent or fraudulent. And so there's no evidence based on the description that that occurred, but I mean, it's possible if you could discover that. Things that are in red are probably not really an option. An action for damages for non-delivery, obviously it was delivered. So, I mean, you know, it's like, well, you wouldn't really sue for that. And then an action for like conversion or recovery of goods or specific performance, probably not as likely either. You know, the best thing is to just reject the non-conforming goods and say, I want the correct, you know, dimensions to fit in my home, or I just want to cancel the sales contract. That's probably going to be the best option. So anyway, as you have questions, please feel free to message me at any time. You can call, text, or email me. But I hope each and every one of you has a good, safe, and productive rest of the week, and I'll be chatting with you all online. Thank you so much.